Welcome to our first module lecture called Introduction to Marriage and Family Therapy. We're basically going to be looking at the historical context. It was so good to read your introductions and to get to know at least a little bit about each one of you in this course. And I hope that you also um, watched my video, my introduction video, and also got to know a little bit about me and looking forward to again a great learning experience with you all. So let's go ahead and get started. In this module, we'll be basically exploring the history of family therapy and how everything came to be in place, what happened before family therapy, and some of the factors that provoked the founding fathers of the field to move forward to begin seeing patients and their families instead of just individuals. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start by, I'm kind of old-fashioned, so I like to start by defining a few words. Basically, we'll be defining family therapy. Sometimes you'll hear people calling this couple and family therapy or CFT. For those of you who are at Michigan State, you've heard of the couple and family therapy clinic at our clinic or the CFT clinic. Some people call it marriage and family therapy. And other people call it family system therapy, other people call it family counseling, but it is basically a branch of psychotherapy that works with families and couples to nurture mental, emotional, and behavior change in development. The whole big deal of family therapy is the privilege of relationships. In family therapy, we are interested in who is in your life, who is not in the room, and we'll get to dive into deeper into that a little later. But the field of family therapy or marriage and family therapy traces its origins in psychiatry, specifically in schizophrenic families. We'll look at that history. Schizophrenia was one of the commonest psychological problems treated in the early 1920s and the 20th century, basically. And so that's how family therapy began to evolve. So we all, in our culture, I don't know about you, but where I come from, there's this move to celebrate the uniqueness of the individual and the search for autonomous self. And we believe in this kind of, I call it the myth of the hero, that you can rise above everyone and make it yourself and be autonomous, be independent, you don't need others. And so when we're young, we watch superhero movies and we believe kind of that some of the things. If you're a fan of Star Wars, you probably, when I was young, I used to like Taekwondo, and there's this guy named Jet Li, and he was my superhero. Um, and then as we got older, we searched for real life heroes, the likes of Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mahatma Gandhi, name it. And these men and women stood for something which we all aspire to be at some point. And only later did we realize that circumstances we wanted to rise above were part of the human experience and our inescapable connection to our families, that we cannot escape our families. And so this kind of romantic sort of image of a hero is based on the illusion that authentic selfhood can be achieved as autonomous individuals. Our culture tells us that we can achieve the superhero image. We can be heroes of our own if we just rise above everyone and do it. Messages we get from our cultures, like growing up personally, we got a message that boys don't cry, you fall down, you stand up, clean the dirt off you, and just move on. And so those subtle messages that we get from our cultures give us this sort of, I call it the romantic image of a hero. But there's a truth we can't deny. We are all defined and sustained by a network of human relationships. Uh, Back in the days, or even now, when people talk about dysfunctional families, it often amounts to parent bashing. For instance, that people suffer because of what their parents did or their mother's drinking. It could be their father's unreasonable expectations. It could be, your mother's psychiatric problems. all that. And so there's this general narrative out there. But one reason for blaming family sorrows on personal failings of parents is that it's hard for the average person, or even myself, to see past individual personalities to the structural patterns that make them, which is a family. This is how I love to define a family, and I know that out there's so many definitions of a family. But I like to define it as a system of interconnected lives governed by strict but unspoken rules. Some of you, or more, all of you, come from families actually. You know that there are those rules that were not spoken, but you just knew they existed. For instance, in my family growing up, we just knew that whenever a guest came home, we knew that we all had to come out of our bedrooms, or we had to come out from whatever we're doing and just come and say hello to the guest. They never taught us that. We grew up and saw our parents do it, and they would pay full attention to the guest, and so other kids were expected to be there and hang out, even if they're talking about stuff that didn't concern the kids. Those are unspoken rules. These are those rules that are spoken. Respect for each other and love one another, and all speak nice to one another, things like those. But then in the early 1920s, that's, none of us was there, I hope. Psychotherapy was a private practice enterprise. So the consulting room was a place of healing as well as a refuge for troubled people and just wanted to run out from a troubling world. And so this idea of hypnosis, will look at ideas of Sigmund Freud, but for hypnosis, that's how it started. People just wanting to get out of the world and its troubles of work and everything, and they wouldn't find the comfort elsewhere but in the psychotherapy room. Parents were worried about their children's behaviors and shyness, and so they sent them to therapy for guidance. You can conclude and say that psychotherapy then displaced the family's role in the solving of just daily life problems. And so it was really like a sanctuary. For those of you who go to sanctuaries or Buddhist temples or Christian churches or mosques, or any sort of sanctuary, you know what I mean, Jewish temples and all that. But again, like I said, we have this illusion of a super hero, or that we can rise above. The culture tells us that we can rise above everybody and be ourselves. We don't need our families. Family therapy still took too long, even though some people recognized that it could help. It still took too long, and two of the reasons why psychotherapy took too long in the 20th century to by this whole idea of family therapy, where there were two existing psychotherapy approaches then, and one of them was Freudian psychoanalysis, and Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy. We'll take a look at both individuals in the following slides, but in brief, both psychotherapies, or both individuals, Freud and Rogers, believe that psychological problems arose from unhealthy interactions with others. They could be people in your family, it could be your friends, it could be people in your circle of relationships, and so they did not buy into the idea of families or having other people in the room. So they believe that problems could be alleviated in a private relationship between a therapist and the client. Sigmund Freud, for instance, I earlier mentioned that he started the psychotherapy method called psychoanalysis. This is a clinical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalyst. Some of you might have heard the hypnosis or hypnotherapy. All those ideas stem from Sigmund Freud. He was Austrian and he was a neurologist, so he studied the science of the nerves and how the brain works to connect with the nerves and impact our emotions, our behavior, and our mental health in general. So Freud believed that the family was the breeding ground of childhood seduction, call it trauma, and later an agent of cultural repression. So, the whole notion of you grow up in your family, and you have to do the thing that your family tell you, and then your family is part of that culture, and so you are kind of under oppression from your family and from your culture, that you can't run out and be yourself. And so Freud, excuse me, I keep saying fluid, but Freud. Remember I told you I speak 5 languages, so sometimes R and L, I get them messed up, but please bear with me. Um, he believed, for instance, that if people grew neurotic or people were afraid of their natural instincts, that they would blame their parents, or that parents were to blame. Freud was interested in the patient's memories and fantasies, and therefore the presence of a family would obscure the patient's subjective truth of the past. So he believed in that so much that he didn't see any value to have families in the room, and people loved it because that's what was there in the 1920s. That's, World War One and post World War One. Um, excuse me. And then came another gentleman, American psychologist called Carl Rogers, and he started another mode of family of psychotherapy called client-centered therapy. For those of you that have taken some family counseling classes, or just basic therapy classes, you might have heard about client-centered therapy. This whole notion of unconditional positive regard, accepting the client the way they are, and so kind of a humanistic approach to psychology and counseling. um, just like Freud, Rogers also believed that problems stemmed from destructive early interactions with people in your family or your friends or people in your circle of relationships. And so he believes that as humans, given an opportunity, we all have an innate tendency towards self actualization. And so that is defined as the realization of one's talents and potentialities, that we all have this desire within ourselves. If we're given an opportunity, we have a desire to realize our talents and potentials and achieve anything we can or we want in life, which is partly true. And some of you might agree with this, some of you might disagree, but he also believed that our instincts for self-actualization get then subverted by our craving for approval, that we as humans, as we try to rise above and actually realize who we are and our talents and our potentials, then we kind of have fall into this trap of wanting to please others. And so our talents are tailored towards what the world or the people around us want. And so Rogers believed that gradually this conflict leads to denial and distortion of the inner promptings and even the feelings that signal them. So there's kind of this, you have a conflict to rise up and be self-actualized, realize your talents and potentials, but then also you have a world here. It's kind of, they're both competing for your attention. Some of you are at that stage, or some of you have passed that stage, but it's kind of a daily life thing. I mean, as I still face it, where you have that struggle. You feel like this is where your gift is, and then but the people are saying this, and there are these pressures and demands from the world, and so you believe that that conflict can be bad. And so Rogers saw the role of a therapist as a midwife, as that of a midwife who is passive but providing support and positive conditional regard. He thought that, or he believed that the therapist listened sympathetically and offered compassion and understanding. And so he thought that in the presence of such a person, the therapist, the patient would gradually get in touch with their feelings and inner promptings, and then they'll get better. So he just maintained absolute privacy in the therapeutic relationship, kept families out, he kept relationships, the people that were in relationship with his clients out. If he got a wife, he wouldn't want the husband in, because he wanted to avoid feelings being subverted to win approval of the other person. So that's why there was no couple therapy then, no family therapy then, because he wanted people to experience their inner prompting of feelings by themselves without feeling like they have to approve of the other person. And part of that is true, because I think it still happens every day, or even now. I can't tell you how many times sometimes I work with clients, and you really see that even with a therapist, the client wants to cry, but they keep apologizing. I'm so sorry. They want to make me happy instead of honoring their own experiences and actually acknowledging them. Even to some of you, you have a feeling and you feel it in you, and that's really you. You want to cry, but because there are people out there, you want their approval, you want them to see you as strong. You kind of hold it in. And so Rogers believed that people needed that space to, be themselves and touch their inner promptings and feelings. And so he believed that only an objective outsider, the therapist, could be counted on to provide unconditional acceptance. Um, Hence, he kept the family members out of his treatment room. So that was a little bit about Carl Rogers and Sigmund Freud, two influential big figures in just the field of psychotherapy in the early 1920s and pretty much the 20th century. So they were individual therapists, and I thought this is since this is an introduction to family therapy, I thought would kind of touch a little bit about the differences between individual therapy and family therapy. Some of you might have an idea, but I don't want to assume. The obvious difference is that individual therapy, you have one person in the room, family therapy, you have more than one person in the room. But although currently there's an argument actually around the United States or even in Canada as to whether you can still do systemic therapy or family therapy with one individual in the room. And I kind of agree to that. It can happen, but it's not as when you have all the people in the room and everyone's perspective is represented. I think there are more layers to that, but it will still work. I will tell you my personal perspective. I think having worked with families for now 3 years and couples, I find it quite challenging to actually work with one individual, because we as humans, just human tendency, we want to talk about the other person when he's not there. And so it's easier when everyone is there and they kind of get to learn new things about the other person. But basically with individual therapy, we are looking at providing concentrated focus to help people face their fears and learn to be fully themselves without others, kind of back to client-centered therapy. It is heavily content focused, and by that I mean a lot of focus is on just the problem, what brings the client to the room. And so there's a little bit of expansion of the context, but not too much. We focus on the problem. You have depression, we'll talk about when it started, how it started, what did you try, what can we do to alleviate those feelings. Keep in mind that sometimes it's difficult to alleviate feelings, to remove feelings from the person. And this is where family therapy comes in to bridge that gap. That someone can have the symptoms and they might not go away, but when they're in supportive relationships, that alone is a buffer for those symptoms. And so, all in all, individual therapy aims at first order change. In the field of family and therapy, we call that reducing the symptoms and terminating from therapy. Symptoms are not gone, they don't have a buffer, but you've been able to reduce them a little bit and let the person go. Whereas for family therapy, we believe that the dominant forces in our lives are in our families. Excuse me. And so we believe that individuals are part of something big. And as we'll look in Module 2 and 3, we'll be looking at some of the concepts in the field of marriage and family therapy. But there is a huge notion called non-summativity. This is the idea that the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. The idea that the entire family as a system is bigger than the individuals who make up that system. So you can see that I'm having a cough, excuse me. So you can see that families are made up of individuals, but still that those individuals are not bigger than the family system as a whole, that the interactional patterns between those individuals influence each other. And so people are people in the family are always triggering each other. We'll look at that later. So family therapy aims at changing the organizational structure and interactional patterns between the family members, whereas individual therapy does not aim at changing interactional patterns. It aims at elevating the symptoms and sending you out. And when we target organizational structure, we call that second order change. And family therapists heavily believe that this is lasting change. I strongly also believe that, because the whole notion of you have a symptoms, or you have, they say you're depressed, or you feel sad or anxious, or and every time you feel anxious, mom is there to support you, dad is there to support you, that you're not dealing with those symptoms alone, or you have friends around. That's kind of the whole idea, that family functions together to fight the problem. Whereas in individual therapy, it's kind of like the client fighting the problem alone, just for to make it easier. It is process oriented. It looks at the processes of interaction between family members or members in the relationship group. In couple and family therapy, we talk about cues, like how partners are always sending signals, and those signals are a trigger to the other partner. So cues, think about them like someone's facial expression. Just the husband will kind of come in the house and he looks very angry, and that immediately will send a signal to the wife, oh my gosh, something is wrong here. And then the wife will either shut down or not say anything. And the more she shuts down, the more the husband wants to talk. And then because he's angry, he tries to talk to the wife, but he sounds like he's lashing at her. And so she gets terrified. And so the more he yells, the more she's terrified and she shuts down. The more she shuts down, the more he wants to talk to her. And so it's kind of the more, it's we call it the bow tie, or the infinity loop, as some people call it, that there's that process that goes on between two people, and that same process happens within families as well. So in family therapy session, we're looking at how does mom talk to son, for instance. We're looking at when dad is talking, what happens to the other members, um, you know, yeah, something like that. So another thing to keep in mind as we explore the historical context of family therapy, we can't forget that just psychology or mental health, you cannot be separated from social context, that who we are and our minds and what we think about the world and our world views cannot be separated from the context where we live. So as a Ugandan, part of most of the things I believe and what how I view myself in the world, a lot of those were formulated when I was young. And so where I grew up and where I lived, learning to respect people and learning the five languages. I mean, learning to think the way I think, a lot has changed as well moving here to America. But you also know from your world that the things that you know in your mind, you learn most of them from either your friends, your social circles, or your family, and so the discovery of the interconnectedness that characterized the human community was a big factor. Forgive my typo there. The word community and words are not separate. But it was a big factor in the birth of family therapy. And so the idea that as humans we're kind of connected to each other in some sort of way, that when my friend is hurting, then I'm kind of hurt as well. Excuse me. So the whole idea that a family is a system, or what I like to call an organic whole, whose parts function in a way that transcends their separate characteristics, that is the individuals. But also, like I said earlier, when we're in families, we don't cease to be individuals. We have our hearts, we have our minds, and we have our own wills. But it is interesting that those are all interconnected to influence one another and the people that we interact with. Um, So working with the whole system means not only considering all members of the family, but also the personal dimensions of their experiences. So this is the bridge of family therapy. How does my experience impact my brother's experience brought together? So that's the whole family therapy. Let's reflect on this case example. I know it's difficult when you are online watching the lecture, but I want you to pause and read that case. If you need to pause the lecture or the video, you can. But consider a case of a husband who complains that his wife won't let him spend time with his friends. The wife may indeed voice her objections, but the fact that the husband surrenders without a fight suggests that he may be conflicted about having fun. Question: will negotiating with his wife clear up this man's inner anxieties about doing things on his own? Probably not. That's probably something he needed to learn when he was growing up in his family. Or if he resolves his own inner conflicts, will his wife, I should have put a comma there, but will his wife suddenly start encouraging him to go out and have a good time? Probably not likely. So, there is a dilemma here. There is in this case, we're basically looking at you as a person, you have your own anxieties, and then those kind of go into to affect the people that are around you. And so, in as much as, in this case, in as much as the man's anxiety might not change just of going out to have fun, but the wife's presence and the wife's complaints have a way they actually make this anxiety even worse, if I'm to put it that way. Does that make sense? I hope so. But, feel free to jot down some thoughts about this case, and you can send me an email or just include them in your discussion post after this video. So the key point from this case is that to provide effective and lasting psychological help, a therapist needs to understand and motivate individuals and influence the interactions. You don't only motivate individuals, but also the interactions, and that's the bridge that family therapy brings. This conviction was at the heart of the founding fathers of family therapy. Another conviction was the breaking kind of a linear thinking versus thinking in circles. A lot of the field of psychotherapy traditionally and mental illness in general has been explained in linear terms. Linear basically meaning, think of it like a line. A causes B. You have a cough, and this is a medicine, and you're fixed. You have depression, this is a medicine, you're fixed, you go, right? But for those of us that might have experienced mental health, we know that linear explanations might not work. Yes, they might work for some things. For instance, if you have a car breakdown, you might say, okay, my tire has broken down, then I need to fix it. You fix the tire and move on. That's a solution. Both medical and psychological paradigms treated emotional distress as a symptom of internal dysfunction with historical causes. And so what this did is that if you are depressed, the assumption was it's your problem, so it's you to fix the problem. It's not upon the family to fix the problem, right? This is kind of sad in a sense, because when you're sick, you need your family. Wouldn't you agree with me? Or when you're not feeling well, you need your significant others to be there, the people that you love and the people you care for. And so human relationships or human problems don't work like that. They are circular or mutual. In other words, A can cause B, and B can cause A, and A can cause C, and C can also cause A. So there is no like A causes B, and if you find a solution to B, if you find a solution, A will be the solution to B or something like that. We will discuss more about circular causality later in module 2 and 3, but basically circular causality was one of the key principles that the founding fathers of family therapy looked at, and they said, well, and most of these, keep in mind, there were psychiatrists, we'll look at them later, but they reach a time when they would treat these people with psychiatric problems and they send them back to families, and then immediately as soon as this one gets better, the other person goes down. And so they were like, there's something going on in the family, we need to see the whole family and kind of treat the whole family. So then there was a revolutionary shift in perspective. And so, as I earlier said, family therapy, FT, is family therapy, originated from psychiatry. Hospital psychiatrists traditionally kept families at arm's length, except if it was for minor reasons. And so in the 1950s, however, two developments forced therapists then to recognize the family's power to alter the course of treatment. Keep in mind, in the 1950s, kind of Sigmund Freud and Carl Rogers were getting out of the field of psychotherapy, and so there were different ideas from psychotherapists or from psychiatrists who are seeing mainly schizophrenic families. Schizophrenia was a big mental health problem in those days, and so there was a big move. Why is it that when a patient got better, someone else in the family got worse? It was kind of, schizophrenia was like a cough. Then, you get off the cough, and then your sister gets it, and then your brother gets it, and then your mother gets it, and then your dog gets it, and then your cat, and it's this cycle of unending coughing. And so that's an example, but that was how it was. And so these people are like, we need to find another solution instead of just seeing one individual. But nonetheless, family therapy was not fully embraced even after establishing this finding. Well, there's something that was accepted. Those were small groups. They kind of were parallels to family therapy in a sense. Group dynamics then were applicable to family therapy because the group life is a complex one, as we know. It's a blend of individual personalities and follow-up properties of the group. So in the 1920s, one of the scholars then, that name William McDowell, initiated the concept of the group mind, where he described how groups continuity depended on the boundaries for differentiation of function and on customs and habits that make relationships. And so he believed that for a group to continue, members had to be differentiated. Members had to have a balanced view of had to balance their independence, but also their dependence. And also, a group had to have customs, and also they had to make kind of relationship predictable. Know what's going to happen. Why am I meeting you today? Are we going to be friends in the next 2 years? If you could predict that, then you can be part of our group. So those dynamics were accepted then. Excuse me. Family members may not be sufficiently unsettled by symptomatic members' problems to consider changing their own ways. And so family members would bring their reference groups with them, but remember, they were kept out of hospitals. So with all its traditions and habits, but then something happened, for anything to take to start, something has to happen. And so a group of men and a few women then, because the field, something I didn't mention, that in the early 20th century, really the field of mental health wasn't diverse in terms of gender and also sexual orientation. There were pretty much Sigmund Freud was a white male. So is Carl Rogers and the people that we look at. So, but these men and a few women forcefully enforced the systemic principles in treatment of families. Let's look at some of these men. One of the leading figures was Gregory Bateson. He was an English anthropologist, a social scientist. He did so many things, so his work kind of intersected with many other fields. He's credited for his work with homeostasis, where he talked about the family's attempts to maintain stability. We'll talk about that later as we explore the concepts next week or the week after. But in the 1940s, Gregory Bateson helped to extend system theory. Remember, he was an anthropologist and a scientist whose background was also in mathematics as well. And so this whole idea of systems, a car being a system and machines being systems, self-regulating systems. So he extended that theory to the social and behavioral sciences, and which is why marriage and family therapy took it on. But the key, pretty much the breaking ground for him, was the grant he got to do the schizophrenia project in Palo Alto, California, in 1952. If you're from California, marriage and family therapy actually started from there. A lot of it started from there. So in this project, Gregory Bateson also again had some collaborations with psychiatrists that were seeing schizophrenic families. And so he treated these with families, and he believed that all communication has two different levels. There's a command and there's a report. The report is the message I send. So if I say, bring me water, that's a report. The command is, I am more in power than you are, or I'm in charge. That's kind of a command. And so he believed that every message has a report and a command. And also, he believed that family stability is achieved by feedback that regulates the behavior of the family and its members. That's where the concept of homeostasis came in. That families resist change because they are afraid of change. They try to maintain stability and maintain the status quo and where they are. Um, you know, Another key figure was Theodore Liesel. This guy also refuted the notion that maternal rejection was the distinguishing feature of schizophrenic families. Remember earlier on, I said that whenever someone was neurotic or they were afraid of their inner feelings, that their mothers were to blame, not even their fathers, but their mothers. And so Theodore Liesel rejected this, and he turned his attention to deficits in the marital relationship and found the absence of raw reciprocity. So, see the connections from maternal. So for him, he said, no, it's not mothers that we can blame for everything. What about what's happening to the fathers? So he believed that in a successful relationship, it's not enough to fulfill your role, i.e., to be effective as a person, but it's also important to balance your role with your partner or your spouse if you're married, to be an effective pair rather than an effective person. And so, from analyzing cases with couples, he came up with two concepts or two types of marital discord. He termed one marital schism and the other marital skew. Marital schism is where husbands and wives undermine each other and they compete openly for their children's affection. Their marriages become kind of a combat zone, and if you have had parents like those, you can tell when they're trying to fight. Their parents, unfortunately, that use their children to fight. It's unfortunate, but it happens. They just don't see value in each other anymore, and and keep in mind that in those days, in the 50s, divorce wasn't a thing, and so parents would fight and there would not be divorce, and kind of the home would be like a combat zone for sure. And then marital skew involves serious character flaws in one partner who dominates the other. This is why we have one partner is kind of takes over everything because the other person is either on drugs or alcohol, and so this other person kind of becomes the bully, runs the show kind of thing. He believed that both extremes are not nice for relationships to function, and that they were key in why schizophrenia was existing in families. Another face was this man here, Lyman Wayne. He began studying schizophrenic families in 1954. And he was struck by the strangely unreal qualities of these families' emotions. He called this pseudo-mutuality and pseudo-hostility, and the quality of the boundaries around them, which Wayne termed rubber fences. Apparently flexible kind of boundaries, but very hard to penetrate for the outsiders. And so basically, pseudo-mutuality, we'll get into much deeper detail about these principles or concepts, but it's where there's conflicts of views or opinions, and it's solved by simply ignoring the problem. So there's a conflict in a family. Wayne believed that conflicts always existed in the family, but because families, remember we talked about homeostasis, families like to maintain the status quo. They don't like to, I think today we use the word rock the boat. They don't want to rock the boat, and so there are families that believe that the best way to solve conflict of views is to just ignore them. Today we know that two things you can't talk about in America: religion and politics, right? You just keep your view, I keep my view, and we'll be good, and God will be the judge of all. That's if you believe in God. And so he coined that pseudo-mutuality, and then pseudo-hostility is the persistent bickering without genuine separation. So people fight, but the tension stays within. When you fight with your family, you can't choose to go to California or from Michigan, but still, you kind of still belong to that family. You will never leave it. So both are family myths, and they are sustained by patterns of behavior that deviate from fixed expectations. The thinking that when you get out of the norm, then that's dangerous for the family. Some of you who come from traditional restrictive families, you can tell that your parents would tell you, if you do this, that's not a family thing to do, right? I grew up in a family like that. This is not a family thing to do. Education is not a family thing to pursue. And so, as someone who chose to pursue a career in education, then I was kind of seen as an outsider. But stuff are changing. So, pseudo-mutual families are so committed to togetherness that there is no room for separate identities. The disadvantage with these families is that they cannot tolerate deeper and more honest relationships and independence. So, and then the rubber friends idea is that these families, pseudo-mutual families, they are committed together, and that there is no room for separate identities. That just someone think about moving out is very scary. So the rubber fence idea was the idea that, or is still the idea that these rigid boundaries that these families created and they surrounded the schizophrenic families, that these boundaries surrounded them. There's limited contact. For instance, families of schizophrenic kids had a hard time extending their boundary beyond sending the kids to school. That would be very anxiety provoking as well. So Lemon One was also there. Big guy. I love this one. I love all the founding fathers, but Maribon was always, when I was in graduate school, he was my favorite because of the genograms. And we'll talk more about genograms in our next module. I'll talk briefly about them now. But Maribon was a psychiatrist and a professor in psychiatry. Among pioneers of family therapy, he started an intervention called genograms, which is a pictorial display of a person's family relationships. Genograms are more, some of you might be familiar with family trees. They're more than family trees in a sense that they show your lineage, your generation, but also they show the relationship lines between the people in your generation. And so family tree will just show grandmother, mom, dad, children. That genogram has a lot of details: religion, work, relationships, boundaries, substance abuse or histories of drug abuse. There's so much in the genograms. And just a reminder, if you didn't watch the beginning or the video that was taking you to our website, helping you to kind of see where everything is. One of our big assignments, the honor big assignment, is actually the genogram paper, where you get to explore your own family using a genogram and kind of write a paper about that. So keep in mind that that's coming. Like many founders of family therapy, Bowen specialized in schizophrenia, and his major interest was in mother and child relationships, which later led to his concept of differentiation of self. Bowen believed that, we'll also talk about this later, but differentiation of self, he believed that for you to be able to be healthy mentally, that you needed to be independent from your family, that you needed to be emotionally independent and not enmeshed. We'll look at another principle. Today we say level-headed, or we say emotionally controlled. You needed to be separate from your families, that when your mom cried, you needed not to cry. You needed not to be influenced by your other family members, in other words. So beginning in 1955, Bowen began to bring family members together to discuss their problems, and he was struck. Remember, he's a psychiatrist, and he was struck by, that was a big move. Before I even talk about that, that was a big move for a psychiatrist. It was very linear. When you go to a doctor, this is a problem, this is a medicine, no more talk, you're out of here, 15 minutes. He was a psychiatrist thinking like that, but then he started seeing families. I think that was a great move. So he was later struck by their emotional reactivity and how feelings overwhelmed reasoning, right? He realized that whenever mom would feel anxious, the rest of the family would not breathe. They will all start to feel anxious. And so Bowen felt the family's tendencies to pull him into the center of of their what he called undifferentiated family ego mass. Basically, make it simple, family stuck togetherness. Families were so stuck with each other that you couldn't tell the difference between mom's emotions and dad's emotions and the children's emotions. They were all like so stuck together. And so he believed that for health, for people to function mentally and to be healthy, that needed to stop. That and he had conversations with families about that. If you go ahead and go to graduate school training in family therapy and you go to a clinical program, which is what I went through, you will get to watch tapes of Bowen, and some of those conversations were pretty powerful to watch. And he made a concerted effort to remain objective. So the ability to remain neutral and attentive to the process rather than the content was what struck Bowen. And he said that this is what distinguished a therapist from a participant in a family drama. That you're not just diving in, but you're seeing their drama, but it's kind of like you're watching from a distance. You're in, and a lot has changed. From that views of you're a therapist, you're an outsider, and you're kind of participating but not participating with this family. That has changed. I practice from an emotional experiential perspective, and so I get into things with my clients, so to put it. I'm very present, I'm very available. I match my clients tone of voice and everything. But Bowen believes that to control the level of emotion, he would encourage family members to talk to him instead of talking to one another, because every time they try to talk to one another, they would start screaming at each other. So he found that it was easier for family members to avoid being reactive when they spoke to the therapist. And so the therapist was kind of there to practice with them. Makes sense? Another guy was Salvador Minuchin. I hope you're noticing a theme here that they are all white men. I mean, Minuchin was Hispanic or South American, but he still looks white. But he's male as well. So that's something that the field didn't have then. There were no women at the start of the field. But he was born and raised in San Salvador. Sorry about that. In Argentina. He moved to America to practice as a family therapist. And with his accent, I love watching his videos. I highly recommend you finding videos of Salvador Minuchin on either YouTube. There is a couple. And just watching him speak, his accent and the way he dealt with families. One of his biggest books he wrote was Families in the Slums, when he had moved maybe like 5 years to Chicago, and he worked with families in those slums. He had a big heart for underprivileged families, and so worked a lot with the Latino populations and African Americans. And so he discovered two common patterns that were in these troubled families. That one pattern was enmeshed and chaotic, which is a tightly interconnected kind of pattern. No boundaries at all. Mom, dad, kids can be in mom's bedroom at any time. It's what he called enmeshment. And then there was also another pattern, which was disengagement. Very isolated families, seemingly unrelated. Think of it this way: dad walks on the other side of the road. I mean, that's the extreme of disengagement, but everyone is on their own, and everyone is doing their own thing. It's just like they're not a family. And so I believe that both patterns were unhealthy for families. To be enmeshed, to be too much enmeshed with another, no boundaries, but also to be so separated there's no feeling of interconnection was also unhealthy. And so both patterns lack clear lines of authority. Enmeshed parents are too entangled with their children to exercise leadership, while disengaged parents are too distant to provide effective support. Minuchin theorized that families were stubborn and resistant to change as well, which is homeostasis, back to Mary Bowen, because for Minuchin, he believed that because families were embedded in a powerful and unseen kind of a structural battle, kids fighting to be the head of the family and dad proving his power, and mom kind of, also proving her power, I guess. So take for instance, if a mother unsuccessfully arguing with her willful child, the mother can scold, punish, reward with gold stars, but as long as she's enmeshed or overly involved, these are parents that do everything for their children, lay their bed, make them breakfast. Literally, the child does nothing. with a child, her efforts will lack force because she lacks authority. So, moreover, because the behavior of one family member is always related to that of others, the mother will have trouble stepping back as long as her husband remains disengaged. So, you have mom who is over involved and mesh with the kids, and you have dad who never participates in matters of kids. And so, both extremes are dangerous because kids don't have a proper structure, they don't have a proper um, kind of line of authority. Mom is with them, they see mom as a buddy, and dad is kind of doing his own thing. And so kids grow up with this kind of psychological confusion in their mind. And so those were some of the leading figures in the field of family therapy as it started in the early 1960s. I didn't take this lecture, we didn't explore all of them. There's more probably 4 or 3 names that I didn't highlight in this lecture, but I will upload some resources to if you're interested in the names. But I thought those big names, those 5 names were kind of the top leaders in the field. More so Mary Bowen, and more so Mnuchin and Kruger Betson. So those 3. Then these others kind of followed later. We didn't talk about Carl Whitaker. We didn't talk about the woman actually was Virginia Satir with experiential family therapy. For those who go in graduate school, you will take a course called Theories of Family Therapy or Models of Family Therapy. I'll show you just a book, but this book actually highlights all the models of family therapy. So if you're curious, you can just go on Amazon and check it out and see, if you're interested in kind of reading about those models before you go to graduate school or before. It's a very good book for practice. It's called Family Therapy Concepts and Methods by Michael Patrick Nichols. So then family therapy came on the field after those men fought hard to have it there. As we earlier said, schizophrenia was the most commonly treated mental health disorder in the 20th century. So people like Mary Bowen, who were psychiatrists, delighted in bringing the parents and children together to transform their interactions in the context of relationships. Mark this, the whole idea of family therapy is about seeing people in the context of their relationship. We believe that when relationships are thriving and when we live in relationships that are healthy, all other pieces of our lives are connected. Now, if you don't believe that, that's still okay. But for those that have experienced, some abusive relationships, you know how that has impacted your school or your mental health, emotional health. And so context of health relationships is very important. So instead of isolating individuals from the emotional origins of their conflicts, problems are addressed at the source, which is the family. There's a myth out there that when you have a problem with your family, you can run out from the family and go live outside the country or live in California or in another state. But here's the challenge. The dilemma is that those problems with the family are emotional. And when we leave, our emotions live with us. They stay with us, So if I don't go back to my family and resolve some of those issues, then they're going to follow me up. That's why we have patterns and generations of emotional problems in relationships, because people run away without solving issues. We'll talk about unresolved family conflicts. And so keep that in mind. So in family therapy, we are not looking for who is the problem, which is individual therapy, who is the problem or what's the problem, but rather we're looking at how we're looking at the interactional patterns. We're looking at how has the interactional patterns between you and your family members or the people in your relationship circle influence the problem. You're depressed, just even how people talk about you and your depression can depress you more. So the person with the problem is simply a symptom bearer of a family's dysfunctions. If it's a child who's acting out in school, and I've seen this in my practice, that when there are children that are acting out in school, usually when I do like a couple sessions with dad and mom, there's usually tension between the couple relationship. And so this child is responding to the symptoms, picking on the family dynamics between dad and mommy, but they don't know that's what they're doing. But psychologically, because our bodies are wired with our brains, they can read that tension and react in that way. Either a child starts to act out, starts to be bully, or starts to do all sorts of things that are quote unquote misbehavior, call it that way. So we believe that people get stuck because of their inability to see their own participation in the problem that plague them. And so in family therapy, the job is to actually give you a wake up call. And so think of it this way: you come to see me and you're complaining that the problem is dad or mom. In family therapy, we're not looking at dad as being the problem or mom being the problem. Remember, that was a shift in thinking. We're looking at, as a family, what has each one of you contributed? Now, there's a contraindication there. For instance, if it's in abusive homes, that has actually been a big criticism of family therapy, that sometimes victims of domestic violence are also put in in difficult position where they are forced to actually see their role in their own abuse, and that can kind of be hurtful. So we want to be also mindful of that. But in general, that we help the entire family to see that each one of you has a way you're triggering each other, and this is what's going on, and we need to, all of us, work out a solution to deal with this problem together as a family. So yeah, that's what family therapy brings to the table: viewing people and relationships, people and emotional problems, and mental problems in the context of relationships. So with that in mind, we'll come to an end of this lecture. Thank you for sticking it out with me with all the cough and all the pauses. I hope that you could hear everything and that you learned something from this lecture. So I would encourage you to read all the materials again and go through these lecture slides again. The slides will be available for um, for the whole semester, but the tasks for every week will be ending at the start of every module. And so in this week's discussion, you're gonna go on your platform. As I gave you the instructions, just click on communication on our D2L site, communication discussions, and then click on discussion one. You're gonna we discuss a lot about main goal of family therapy being treating mental, emotional, and behavior problems in the context of relationships. Basically, we're gonna discuss in one paragraph. I want you to engage with your colleagues about how you think the coming of family therapy revolutionized psychotherapy. If you've never been to family therapy, you can use the theories that you learned today or some of the content that I talked about. Do you see more benefits towards improving people's problems using a systemic approach than an individual approach? If yes, tell us what are they, and if not, give us your reasons. Other than that, I'm so excited. Week one is done. I look forward to a wonderful discussion with you all and reading some of your posts and insights. And I look forward to speaking with you and answering your questions on email. And I also look forward to speaking with you next in module 2. Thank you very much.